Okay, so good afternoon, class. Today I'll be presenting the first two articles of this week um, on Ken on Kenyan democracy. So the first article, called "The Resilience of the Past: Government and Opposition in Kenya." It was written by Suzanne D. Mueller. She received her PhD at the University of Nairobi. Um, she was a researcher at Boston University's African Studies Center. She worked for the UN and its agencies in the World Bank in several countries. She won the 2008 Best Article of the Year award from the African Politics Conference Group of American Political Science Association. So here are some key terms that you're going to see throughout the presentation and that were in the article. So we have terms like democratization, government, opposition, repression, statism, comparative political economy, ethnicity, and others. The methodology of this is that there are four main sections. We have our intro, the colonialism period, independence period, which has four subsections of its own: the Kenyatta period, the Moi period, the Mwai Kibaki period, the Uhuru Kenyatta period, and the conclusion. So the intro, Mueller starts off by telling us that Kenya has displayed a remarkable ability to reinvent the status quo, and that the state and its enforcers still use the carrot and the stick to entice or punish their opponents. For those who don't know what the carrot and the stick is basically a method of reward and punishment where the carrot is the reward and the stick is the punishment. So the purpose of this article was to examine legacies of repression and governmental responses to dissent in Kenya from the colonial period until the present, and to examine discussions of repression, of opposition, and dissent. So basically, she wants to know why it continues, how it works, and the reason for its continued salience. This was done by looking at the characteristics over time, discussing what has persisted and what has changed. The main argument was simply that progressive changes have occurred. These include the end of the one-party state, the introduction of presidential term limits, and many more. And she tells us that some of the changes that occurred have led to the use of organized violence against opponents to win election and increased ethnic polarization. So then we jump into the colonial period. We are told that the colonial period in Kenya is key to understanding the country's political economy today, as many of its features continue. Under colonialism, the government developed a highly authoritarian set of institutions, laws, and tactics made to administer the country and repress emerging African associations opposed to its rule. They had civil servants, or what I like to call snitches, who were the government's eyes and ears. They were expected to inform the executive of any so-called bad hats who would be detained, who should be detained, or subversive groups that should be banned. The highlight of this period was in 1944 after Eliud Matthew was appointed to the Legislative Council, where Africans were finally allowed to form national association, the Kenyan African Study Union. This is important because Africans could only form local associations up until then. But this didn't last long because it fell under the Mau Mau situation in 1952. The chief and members of the Home Guard got land and government jobs after the independence for repressing the Mau Mau. So essentially, to top off this period, those who did not play ball with the colonial government and were in opposition of it suffered. So now we hop into the independence period, starting with the Kenyatta period. So the Kenyatta government was said to have kept most of the laws and regulations from the colonial era, which had been used to stifle and repress descent and the provincial administration and keep the provincial administration intact. It passed numerous constitutional amendments, such as Kenya becoming a republic and passing a Preservation of Public Security Act in 1966 to further centralize its power and work to eliminate opposition political parties. By 1964, both opposition parties, the Kenya African Democratic Union, the KADU, and the African People's Party, the APP, dissolved and joined the Independence Party, the KANU. The KANU were starved for funds, sidelined, and soon recognized the wisdom of joining the KANU, and the APP just folded. And this turned Kenya into a de facto one-party state. Soon after this, another split happened within the KANU between the conservatives and the radicals. The two groups disagreed about politics, with the radicals supporting a more socialist orientation. In 1966, the Odinga group established the Kenya People's Union, the KPU. This led to a number of punitive measures that made it costly for individuals to join the opposition. Mueller tells us that both the stick and the carrot were used to destroy the KPU. She tells us that on the stick side, the government used methods from the colonial period, making it difficult for KPU to register branches, hold public meetings, or travel to outlying districts to spread their message. The government also labeled them as communist, seditious, and harassed its MPs and its supporters in public meetings. On the carrot side, Kenyatta expanded the size of his cabinet to induce KPU MPs to rejoin KANU. And he also used KANU youth wingers to rough up KPU MPs and their supporters. She ends off by telling us that the legacy of the Kenyatta period set stage for further repression later on, and were reminiscent of what we saw in the colonial period. So next we jump to the Moi period, which was truly disastrous, and we're about to see why. So Moi was Kenya's third president. He was seen as someone who would keep Kenyatta's machine in place. Little did people know that he was worse than Kenyatta. Just like Kenyatta, he used the carrot and the stick to dismantle any opposition to him. In 1982, he amended the constitution and made Kenya a one-party state. Later, he passed another law that increased his power personally. Moi was said to see demons everywhere and in everyone. He trusted no one. He kept his cabinets off balance by constantly changing it and making sure that no one thought they're permanent. He detained numerous politicians, lawyers, university lecturers, and students and their supporters. Some just disappeared. The regime killed others. Elections under him were a joke because Moi had his hand in everything. And here we see one of the most villainous quotes that I've ever read, which states, "Why buy a judge when you can own one?" So after this, Mueller tells us that essentially Moi brought Kenya's economy to its knees. Laws and ordinances were abandoned in construction. Basic infrastructure such as roads, water, and telecommunications fell apart. Tap water looked blackish, and people either boiled their own or bought bottled water. So only the pressure from Kenyan activists and donor threats to withdraw structural adjustment funds in 1991 finally forced Moi to change the constitution once again. This meant the ending of the prohibition on more than one party. Along with this, the law changed in 1992 to limit future presidents to 2 5-year terms. Moi is said to have changed the dynamics of repression by using Kalenjin gangs who killed and violently displaced Kikuyu and other upcountry voters to ensure his own victory. So overall, as we see, the Moi period was a mess and is said to have opened a Pandora's box of consistently diffusing extra state violence, like the likes of which we have not seen before. So we hop into the next period, the Moi Kibaki period. So a great wave of enthusiasm greeted the 2002 elections. There was a general air of hope that that real change would be possible, the opposition united around Kibaki and won. The government initiated popular moves such as bringing in human rights groups into its fold with the formation of several commissions, such as the Kenyan Commission of Human Rights, with Maina Kiai at its head. It seemed that Kenya's repressive past had mostly evaporated, but it was just what I like to call a honeymoon period. Kibaki used the carrot to incorporate potential opposition dissenters, vastly expanding the size of his cabinet and the salaries of both ministers and MPs. The stick also reasserted itself. The government undercut constitutional change in various conferences. The deal breaker for the new government was a massive corruption scandal known as Anglo leasing. So basically what happened here was unflattering pictures of the government elite were published. The press exposed Kibaki's family for its relationship with foreign drug barons. And in spite of liberalization, the Kibaki government was forced with a legacy of Moi's past violence, which reinserted itself. This included the continued diffusion of violence and the emergence of the increasing number of extra state militia available for hire by politicians and others. So in short, in spite of certain changes and opening of political space, both the use of and potential use of government carrot and stick continued to feeder opposition and dissent and make it costly. So I see that I'm almost over time here. So the Uhuru Kenyatta period, I'm gonna speak about it briefly because the next article kind of goes more into depth about this period. So basically what's important to know is that during this period, the prospect of the ICC trials has weighed heavily on Kenyatta and Ruto and has defined their response to opposition and dissent. This made the courts Kenya's new opposition. And it's also important to know that the government passed a law that put the media under a government-controlled authority and allows it to impose crippling fines on individual journalists and owners. So remember this for the next part of the presentation. So the conclusion. So basically, this could all be summed up by saying Kenya's politics have been a complete roller coaster ride, but I think this quotation kind of explains it all, where it states a small socio-economic elite still controls Kenya and contests for presidency circulates among the elite. So critical analysis. So the strength of the article is that unlike most poli-sci articles, this was actually interesting to read and made me want to engage more with external sources. And the weakness for me is the main argument really, because it sounded very contradictory. So she states that things have changed, but remain the same. And then she goes on to show us how essentially nothing changed, which is kind of confusing and contradictory, as I said. So now we'll be hopping on to the next article, The Return of the Tyranny by Henry McCrory. He was an editor at Pambazuka News. Here are some of the key terms that I'm gonna be using throughout the presentation and that you see in the article. So tyranny of numbers, jubilee, free speech, evil society, authoritarianism. The methodology of this was, there are 7 sections: tyranny of numbers, the real winner, evil society, emerging authoritarianism, reviving colonial tactics, silencing media, and free speech, and the conclusion. So basically, we hop into the tyranny of numbers section. So the tyranny of numbers is the claim that Kenya's voting is hysterically influenced by ethnicity. and this is just one of the claims. The credit for this was given to Mutahi Nguni. So basically, in the March 2013 election, Nguni prophesied that Kenyatta would pull a surprise victory and win based off the votes of the country's two largest ethnic blocs, the Kikuyu and the Kalenjin. His reasoning for this was because Kenyatta was Kikuyu, and then his running mate, William Ruto, was Kalenjin. Most of the critics laughed it off, as we expect, and called it a wild speculation. So later on, Kenyatta went on to win with slightly over 50% of the vote. Here, there are two reasons why Kenyans never had expected that the victory of Uhuru Kenyatta would herald the return of actual tyranny to the country. The first was that from 2002 to 2012, this was the longest period since independence that Kenyans had lived relatively free without extensive and systematic state repression. The second reason is that in 2010, the country voted for a new constitution that was underpinned by a robust bill of rights and many more changes that assured Kenyans that the state tyranny was gone forever, regardless of who came into power. The biggest issue with Kenyatta and his running mate, Ruto, was that they were both standing in trial for crimes against humanity at the ICC. Fast forward in the article, the prosecutor of the ICC withdrew the crimes against humanity charges against Kenyatta and Ruto because of witness tampering, deaths, disappearance, recanting of testimonies, and lack of cooperation by the Kenyan government. Another concern was about Kenya's image, and people thought it would be tarnished internationally if Kenyatta and Ruto were both found guilty of their crimes. This would potentially lead to allies in the West who backed the ICC trials, isolating Kenya, and rightfully so. So now we hop onto the real winner. So it starts off with a quotation by Professor Thiango, who says that the real winner was a man who wasn't even on the ballot, Daniel Arap Moi. And if you remember from the first article, he was the one with the tumultuous regime where everything fell apart. So he states that Kenyatta and Ruto were Moi's political proteges. He says that when multi-party politics was reintroduced in Kenya in 1991, Moi turned to Ruto to conduct a campaign of violence and intimidation where thousands of residents were forced to flee. As for Kenyatta, it was Moi who nominated him to parliament. Both Kenyatta and Ruto both later served in Moi's cabinet. So this section ends off with a quotation that states that the faction of the political divide represented by Kenyatta and Ruto is the section of Kenyan society that has monopolized political economic power since independence in 1963. Both Kenyatta and Ruto represent entrenched interests of the capital. So next we have evil society. After the Jubilee's victory, the terms evil society emerged on social media, propagating a grotesque narrative created by bloggers allied to the administration. The Jubilee Coalition had a burning animosity towards the civil society, and this was connected to the ICC trials because some organizations provided crucial support to the ICC. So naturally, that made them enemies of Kenyatta and Ruto. Leading activists were openly vilified, some were physically attacked. Within months of Kenyatta's inauguration, attacks and threats against human rights defenders and other activists had escalated. In an attempt to stop civil society, the government crafted a bill to amend the Public Benefits Organization. So basically the bill proposed a cap on foreign funding of Kenyan PBOs, limiting such funds to 15% of their total budget. And it also required all PBOs fundings to be channeled through a government body, which would alone decide which organization got money and for what purpose. Basically, this bill was never passed, and rightfully so, because this sounds like something chaotic. Okay, so now we're at the emerging authoritarianism part. Basically, a new bill was introduced with new criminal offenses, harsh penalties, the right of arrest and accused persons curtailed, and severe restrictions on the exercise of fundamental freedoms were imposed. On December 24th, the opposition and civil society organizations headed to the court to fight this new security law. 2 months later, a five-judge bench declared many provisions of the act unconstitutional, and this was seen as a victory of civil liberties and a blow to emergent authoritarianism in Kenya. So, reviving colonial tactics. The Supreme Law demanded an overhaul of the much loathed provincial administrations that had been used by the government from the colonial days to brutalize and repress citizens. And then we have a quote by Professor Yashpal Gai, who says we're rapidly slipping into the Kenyatta Moi period, Moi area. So he says this because of the Kasarani concentration camp situation, where basically a bomb went off in the Eastleigh suburbs in Nairobi, killing 6 people. And this suburb was mostly populated by ethnic Somalis. The government claimed that members of the Somali-based militant group Al-Shabaab had cells in Eastleigh and were radicalizing youth and recruiting others to the group. I find this statement really hypocritical because basically this is what Kenyatta's father was doing before he came into power, but that's besides the point. Following the bomb attack, police launched a massive violent crackdown on ethnic Somalis in Nairobi. More than 1,000 Somalis were sent to the Kasarani National Stadium. The roundup caused an outcry with Kenyans using Twitter hashtag Kasarani concentration camp to demand the release of the citizens. It is said that the Jubilee government was using the same brutal strategies against the Somalis as the British colonialists used against the Mau Mau. Hundreds of citizens were held dirty in overcrowded cells in criminal violation of their constitutional rights. Abuses were widespread, including detention of children together with adults. And police officers used the operations to enrich themselves by extorting bribes. Basically, Kenya's police force has not only refused to reform in accordance with the constitution under the Kenyatta and Ruto regime. Instead, the force is again being used for repression. Here we see colonial era tactics being used against activists in any form of activism or an organizing, which created an atmosphere of controlled violence against any activities that are, for whatever reason, seen as a threat to the government. This section is the silencing media and free speech. And basically it is what it is. We see it starts off with a quotation from Kenyatta's inauguration speech, where he says, "I will champion the right of every Kenyan to speak their mind free of fear and reprisal or condemnation." This section of the article just shows us how he contradicted his statement, because the government passed 2 anti-media bills after this. Under the laws, a government-controlled body is mandated to punish journalists and media houses whose reporting is perceived to be against the law. Steep fines were used, with 218,000 on media houses, and over 10,000 on individual journalists were imposed. It was not just media houses and journalists that were punished by this law. A university student was also sentenced to a year in prison and fined $2,000 for insulting Kenyatta on Facebook. The article concludes with a statement. Basically, we're told that another bill was published that seeks to remove the supervisory powers of the court to question the constitutionality and legality of proceedings and decisions of the parliament. And then we have this quote here that states that Kenya has never achieved true independence. Full independence can be brought about by revolution. And it also says that it is necessary to destroy, to break to ash all aspects of the colonial states before independence can truly be achieved, which is something I agree with. So critical analysis. The strength of the article was that it was well detailed and well thought out. It elaborates on the final period of the last article, which I thought was pretty cool. The weaknesses is that it doesn't explain certain concepts such as tyranny of numbers, which was very hard for me to try to find what it was. So discussion question. My discussion question for you guys is, do you think there is light at the end of the tunnel for Kenyan politics, for Kenyan democracy, I mean?